Hello and welcome back. It's Matt here from Christopher Shaw with my colleague James, as always. And today we're going to be discussing a new topic for us, which is discussing when you're selling or buying a property with a tenant in situ. This is something that's become quite common, in particular over recent months.
Yeah, I think that we've seen several people come to us looking to sell their rental properties. Sometimes people buying them, or people buying them as first-time investments, or sometimes they are landlords, existing landlords looking to take on further properties into their portfolio. But what we wanted to do today was get some expert advice or take an expert view on some of the practical considerations that you need to make when you are dealing with a property with a tenant in place.
So that brings us nicely on to our guest today, which is the lovely Laura Mabin from one of our favourite firms to deal with, which is Frettens Solicitors, I believe from the Christchurch office. Welcome, Laura. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, hello everyone.
Hello. So Laura, we'll get straight into it because I know you're a busy person. You've got lots to do. What does a conveyancer look for on a landlord-to-landlord transaction specifically?
So when we look at landlord and landlord transactions, the main thing we'll look at is obviously copies of the tenancy agreements, deposit scheme, where the deposit's held, if it's held by anybody. If it's not, we'll obviously need to look into why that's not been held. We'll look at the inventory, so if there's furniture remaining at the property. We'll look at references if they're available. There's quite a long list of things we look at. So if there's right to rent checks that we check for,
Yep.
And whether the tenant's been given those or not. Obviously up to date gas and electric certificates, if they've not been done, why have they not been done, as obviously that's kind of an essential quality of being a landlord. Payment records of the tenant if the tenant's remaining in situ, if those are available. And if there's like smoke alarms, if there's carbon monoxide alarms, all the safety aspects that obviously a landlord would need to think about, because it may cost them money if it's not been done, and obviously the risk of what the tenant may do if it hasn't been done. And we also just kind of look at the EPC, because obviously the regulations and that seem to be changing regularly, but making sure that that's in accordance with it being able to be let out. And then we look at if there's an existing letting agent in situ and whether that's going to be continued, and whether they need to be notified of any changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I can take from that is you need to be quite organised with your paperwork as a landlord and that. None of that, I know we're looking at this from an agent and a solicitor perspective, but none of that really is scary for us. That's all stuff that we would have on file. But I can imagine a lot of landlords might not have easy access to a lot of that documentation, or maybe, hasn't filed it properly. So there is actually quite a lot of organising before you go to market, really, to get all of that documentation in order.
Yeah.
You don't use an agent, for example.
So we find we often rely on letting agent, especially if there are dual aspects, sell and letting agent. They'll normally pass over to the letting agent to kind of deal with it. If it's kind of a standalone landlord without a letting agent, it can sometimes delay transactions if they've not got the documentation available, especially if we're using mortgage finance to purchase. We've got strict rules to adhere to. Obviously, there's other things as well. So if our client's buying a leasehold property, there's often restrictions on how that property can be rented, if it can be rented at all. So that's also something we look out for kind of at the outset if we know that our client's going to be renting, because we obviously need consent from the landlord, or specific letters, or there might be further steps that the tenant may need to do, like enter into a deed of covenant, which is a promise that they'll basically step into the owner's shoes, the landlord. Obviously the words get confused, but the landlord for the tenant steps into the shoes of the landlord as the owner of the flat.
So, with some of the compliance stuff that you're looking at, do you report separately on that, or is that part of another report that you will offer to a purchaser?
So what we kind of do at the outset on all transactions, especially if it's leasehold, at the beginning, kind of at the outset, we'll review our clients' little forms and what they're seeking to do with the property. If they're looking to let the property from the outset before we kind of submit searches or anything, we'll notify them and let them know whether that is allowed, whether consent's needed. Because if we get to a point where we've incurred costs from searches, etc., and then it turns out they can't sublet the property, then you've kind of wasted everybody's time. So we kind of do that at the outset, but we'll do a lease report if it's leasehold and advise basically what the conditions are within that, and then kind of raise inquiries if it's a freehold property and advise the client that we're looking for X, Y, and Z, and this is because you're renting, and we'll go into detail like that.
Okay, and so with a tenanted property, for example, when can a landlord look to sell that? And is a tenant obliged to allow them to conduct viewings while there's still a tenancy in place?
Okay, so if it's an assured short hold tenancy, so an AST, and that generally is what we deal with, or kind of rolling contracts after that. We don't really deal with any kind of form of other agreements. As long as that tenancy agreement's been in situ for at least 4 months, after that time, the landlord can look to serve the Section 21 notice. The Section 21 notice is obviously notifying the tenant that they're looking to either sell or do whatever, and they need the property back. And that's the client, the tenant notice that they will want the property back. So as long as it's not within the first 4 months of the tenancy, they can look to do that. In relation to the tenant allowing visits, it very much depends if it's written within the agreement. So it's not an automatic right for a landlord to allow viewings to happen at the property, and so if it's agreed in the tenancy agreement, they need to give 24 hours notice to the tenant at the very minimum to let them know the viewing is going to happen. If it's not written into the tenancy agreement, they would need to request the permission of the tenant to allow viewings into the property.
So coming to some sort of mutual arrangement over, if it was earlier than that, for example, if there was a mutual arrangement that it's being sold to another landlord, then, or the aim is to sell it to another landlord, then that's okay if everybody is in agreement that that's an acceptable way to move forward.
So in relation to the validity of a Section 21 notice, it's generally not valid if it's happened within the first 4 months of that tenancy agreement. So a tenant would be able to challenge that. But after those 4 months, the Section 21 notice would be agreed. But if obviously they have the tenant in situ, like you say, they're obviously not giving notice that they're evicting them effectively from the property, so they would be able to sell the property to another landlord. It would just be that landlord's changing hands.
Good.
So sorry, just crackled then. So what I take from that is you could put it on the market at any point as long as you weren't looking to evict the tenant. Is that correct? So it could be month 2.
Yes.
If it was just selling from landlord to landlord. Awesome. So that leads on to another kind of, for us, sometimes more complicated matter, which is the deposit, which obviously is registered by the previous landlord or the agent. Should it be reprotected when a new owner takes over ownership of a property, or can it stay in place?
So what we look at is that obviously it begins in a protected scheme, and the main ones that we see are the tenant deposit scheme, deposit protection service, and my deposit. And these government-backed schemes. We obviously kind of leave that to the letting agent as to how they're going to deal in relation to transferring it on. Often we would obviously recommend to our clients that it's reprotected, so that obviously they've got full access to that. It's not registered back to the previous landlord. Whether they decide to get insured schemes, so they can go along with these schemes uninsured, or whether they choose to go for an insured scheme where they have to pay a premium for each one, that's up to the client. That's ultimately up to them what they choose to do with their insurance.
Okay, cool.
So we've got through all the compliance, we've got through all the conveyancing, we've got to the very end. What happens at that point? When does the tenant get informed that they got a new landlord, or at what point does that need to be advised to the tenant?
Okay, so on completion, it's standard practice. So within 2 months of completion, the new landlord should notify the tenant that they are the new landlord, providing them with details of how they can be contacted So the letting agent's address, etc., what their names are, and basically contact details. This is called a Section 3 notice under the Landlord and Tenant Act. What we tend to do, we'll tend to do this on behalf of our clients, and basically send them a letter to the tenant, kind of a rental authority letter, confirming that this is the new landlord, this is how they can be contacted, so it avoids kind of that 2-month delay happening. If it's left in the hands of the landlord, we'll notify them ourselves.
I was going to say 2 months feels like a long time.
Yeah,
to not know who your landlord is.
Because obviously there's a
yeah, and I think it's all by the wayside.
That seems like a long time, but like James says, yeah, who do you pay your rent to? So
Yeah.
I think that's really good that you send that. I wasn't aware that you would send that. I think we would feel normal for us to kind of bridge that communication gap, but it's good to know that you serve that document as well, which gives it, like you say, validity for the tenant, which is awesome.
I guess really the last thing that we sort of didn't cover at the start is obviously when you're buying a second property, regardless whether it's got a tenant in or not, there are additional stamp duty costs. Could you just run us through those, please?
Yeah, so obviously if you're buying as an investment, or kind of any kind of so if you're purchasing as an investment, and you own other property, you will be liable for high rate stamp duty. This is normally 3%, but we would always do a standard calculation for whoever we're purchasing. So at the outset, we'll do a quote based on the information that's supplied, and then our clients will also fill out a declaration to confirm whether they own other property, whether they're replacing their main residence. And it's also something to consider if later on they decide to change their use of how they use the property. If it becomes commercial premises, there may be stamp duty implications there. But often if you're buying a property to be let out, you normally own other property, so you will be liable for higher rate stamp duty.
Okay, great stuff. Well, Laura, thank you very much for joining us today and going over this topic. I think that it will be useful for a lot of people that aren't aware of what the ramifications are for some of these things. But I think the big thing from it really is get your paperwork at the start.
I think that's
that was loud and clear to me.
That's a common thing with whenever Frettens come on, it's get your paperwork right, and I think that continues with this. Be organised, get your paperwork sorted beforehand, and if you've got an agent, then hopefully that should be quite a simple process.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Laura.
Yeah, it definitely makes it easier.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Speak soon.
Cheers. Bye bye.